All right, good to be back with y'all. This is video number 2, and I'm not quite so nervous. Still a little bit, but not nearly as bad as I was my first one. I realize there's a lot of things I need to work on. I noticed I said way too many times in the first video. As I get better, that'll go away. There's a couple things that I forgot to talk about. I forgot to mention that the excerpts that I use, they're going to be from my books. That one was from Exposing the Wiles of the Devil. This one is going to be from Exposing the Wiles of the Devil as well. It's going to be under the chapter of having a Christian worldview, and it's about inflation. And is it prophesied in the Bible? I found myself referring to my grandmother's advice and knowledge that she gave me the older that I get. And it turns out she was a lot wiser than what I believed at the time. She was always telling me that someday that there would be no middle class. There would only be the rich and the poor. Seeing the way that the world has operated since COVID and the housing crisis of 2009, it's really opened my eyes to this. They both seem to follow the same theme as the Great Depression. The rich got richer and the poor got poorer, and the middle class keeps continuing to shrink, just like she said. Just like the buying power of our money continues to decrease. Would you believe me if I told you that this was practice, that this very practice is prophesied in the book of Revelation? So I think what we're going to do is, just like we did last time, we're going to go through a few different Bible translations, Bible versions, and then look at a couple commentaries, and then we're going to look at some contemporary things that have happened just in this last century, and it's going to be a pretty neat little journey. So these things fascinate me. I pray that this reaches the audience that finds it just as fascinating as well. So with that, we'll move on to our next slide. So we got 5 different Bible versions we're going to read here, and as you can see, I've got the measurements in yellow and I've got their prices in red. So as you go from version to version, you can see the yellow and the red and see how they differ. It's just like for the root of all evil being different in their interpretations. These are very diverse too. So with that, we'll get started with, and this one's out of the ESV. It's Revelation 6:5 through 6. It says, "When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, 'Come.' And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and his rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, 'A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine.'" The rest of the versions, I'm not going to read Revelation 5. I'm just going to read Revelation 6, because you already got a gist of, that's not really where we're going with it anyways. But so, "And I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 beasts say, 'A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. And see thou hurt not the oil and the wine.'" This is out of the King James Version, 1900, by the way. The New International Version reads it like this: "Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures, saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wage, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wage, and do not damage the oil and the wine." This is how the New Living Translation, or the NLT, renders Revelation 6:6. "And I heard a voice from among the 4 living beasts say, 'A loaf of wheat bread or 3 loaves of barley will cost a day's pay. And don't waste the olive oil and the wine.'" Lastly, the ASV, or American Standard Version, reads it like this: a measure of wheat for a shilling, and 3 measures of barley for a shilling, and the oil and the wine heard thou not. So for the measurements, we have a quart, we have measure used twice, once in the KJV and once in the ASV, and we have pounds, and we also have loaf to describe how much wheat and barley. And then when it comes to the cost, we have a denarius, we have a penny, we have a day's wage, a day's pay, and a shilling to describe the price. We appear to have a contradiction. The KJV says the wages are a penny. The other 2 translations say it's a day's wage. That's in today's world, it's a very stark difference between a day's wage and a penny. And that right there is rock solid evidence of just how much inflation has been affecting our modern world. When I first started driving, gasoline was 85 cents a gallon. I'm really showing my age now. My dad made $20 an hour, but a very nice house cost $30,000, and a very nice car was less than $10,000, and just the dad could work off that, and the mom could stay home, and you could live nice. You could go on vacations every year, and it's not like that anymore. The wages have barely gone up, but the prices of everything else have gone up and up and up. And like I said, that's just proof that inflation by design has steadily increased over the years. Just in my lifetime, it's ridiculous. And the Bible said that's the way it's going to be in the end. And it's funny that when I understood what this means, it really opened my eyes to the Bible actually being able to dictate the way I think and the way that I feel. Because if the Bible can predict this, and I can be given substantial proof that it's going on, and John wrote it thousands and thousands of years ago, then that means that what else does the Bible write about? So finding this out really helped strengthen my faith in Scripture and the authority of Scripture and the truth of Scripture. And so hopefully when I show you guys this, it'll help you too if you've never seen it. In the last slide, I said that the penny and the day's wage proved inflation, but I didn't explain it very well. In the 1600s, whenever the translators of the KJV were doing their thing, a penny was probably close to a day's wage. Of course, obviously, we don't even have a penny no more. They did away with it. So that's the proof, is that, now it's depending on what kind of job you do. For me, it's a couple $150 per day is a day's wage, which is a staggering difference between a penny. But anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to jump to the commentaries now. I've got a couple of them in a study Bible. And this is James, 1st and 2nd Peter, Jude, and Revelation, and the notes on 6:6. A loaf of wheat bread or 3 loaves of barley will cost a day's pay. Literally, a chonics of wheat for a denarius, and 3 chonics of barley for a denarius. The denarion represents a day's pay. A quart of wheat would sustain 1 person for a day. 3 quarts of barley would sustain a family for a day. So now we're starting to get into the real meaning of it. What it's saying is, when this tribulation, when these 4 riders are unleashed, this rider is going to be carrying a set of scales, and that's an economic judgment. That's what that means. And that's in 6:5. It says he's going to be carrying a pair of scales. Well, a day's wage is only going to be able to buy enough wheat for one person to survive for one day. Or, and that's the higher quality, or for barley is enough for a family to survive one day on one day's wage. So now let's put this up in today's terms. Let's just say I have to eat 6 sandwiches a day to survive, because that's all I can afford. Now, that's 6 slices of bread. Let's just say 6 slices of bread cost me, and I'm at a little bit over $30 an hour. Let's say I work 8 hours a day, $240 for 6 slices of bread. That's what that's saying. So we can see that the inflation in this time is going to be terrible. And it's bad right now, but it's not that bad. But it's not going to get any better. I just looked it up today. The inflation rate is at 4%. And when Joe Biden was in office, it was way worse than that. And they actually even changed the way they calculate inflation just to keep it under our nose. Because back in I think it was early 70s or early 80s, they used to calculate it different. And if we still calculated it the way they did back then, the inflation would have been more like 15% after COVID. So they try to hide that from us, and they're not exactly being 100% honest on how they do that. But anyway, moving on. The imagery represents poverty conditions at the most elemental level of existence. Don't waste the olive oil and wine. The image could speak of the preciousness of all the commodities during a time of crisis. Or the image may represent economic conditions in which the poor and marginalized are being ground down, but the wealthy are untouched, for they could afford the oil and wine. Later in the vision, John sees adverse economic dimensions in the human community as a result of Satan's rebellion. See commentary on 13:16 through 18. The third horseman is a variant image of the same reality. Now, they offer 2 explanations there, and I really think it's the second one. I think that makes the most sense, especially if you look at it. And if you remember in the introduction, I was talking about how after COVID, after the housing crisis of 2009, and after the Great Depression, what happened? The rich got richer, and that's exactly what it says here in Revelation 4, and that's what's so fascinating about it. But don't touch the oil or the wine, because the rich people aren't going to be affected by this. They're not going to be in this crunch that the everyday people are going to feel. And boy, when you see that play out, and I can just feel it in my spirit that that's what they intend. And, you know, we're not ignorant of Satan's devices, because the Lord has provided those of us who will pay attention the answers in Scripture. And these are just one of the answers that I just want to share with you. And I just hope you just grasp onto that, and you can see the truth in that. You can feel it in your spirit that this is really what's going on. The Faith Life Study Bible seems to echo the same sentiment as the other commentary we just read. And I did not notice this until now, but the 66th chapter or book of the Bible, and the 6th chapter makes 666 up here on this slide. That's kind of creepy. And it's crazy how it's talking about the rate of inflation, but I'm sure that's not what John meant, but it's still kind of weird. But it reads like this: a quart of wheat for a denarius, suggestive of someone rationing out supplies in a government food line and selling them at inflated prices. Compare 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 24 and 25. A denarius, the coin mentioned here in the Greek text, was a day's wage earned by a common laborer. Such rations could feed only one person, so a worker would not have been able to afford to feed his family. The result would have been widespread hunger and starvation. The olive oil and the wine, the necessities, wheat and barley, are sold for exorbitant prices, but luxury items, oil and wine, are unaffected. This may point to the role greed can play in intensifying the effects of a famine. So I don't really have too much to add to that because it just affirms what I said. In Deuteronomy, I believe it also in Leviticus, it says, when Moses is given the law, he says, out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall one establish a testimony. So that's what I try to do. I try to get at least two different sources, always 2 or 3 Bible verses if I can, and 2 or 3 commentaries, and so I can, it doesn't look like I'm cherry picking or proof texting, because it's, it's a good way to get some bad doctrine, is to just try to go off one verse and wing it. So that's what I do. So now that we know that this inflation that's going to happen when all these judgments amongst, others, especially the economic judgment that we're talking about in the last days, we got to ask ourselves, well, how's that happen? What are the events that make this happen to be put into place? Well, it could be a variety of things. It could be cataclysms, it could be catastrophes. Like I said, back right after COVID, if they went by the old way of calculating inflation, it was 15%. So it could be a crisis. But there's also another institution that's been in place since the early 1900s that has a whole lot to do with inflation, and that's the Federal Reserve. I got this right off of their website. It says, as the Federal Reserve conducts monetary policy, it influences employment and inflation, primarily through using its policy tools to affect overall financial conditions, including the availability and cost of credit in the economy. So see, they are basically admitting that they're the ones, they control the interest rate. They decide based on inflation whether to raise the rates or to lower the rates. They are the cause. That is the reason why when people are 20 and they're putting in their money into savings for years and years and years, and inflation goes up every year for about 3.5%, but yet the wages don't go up 3.5% for most of us. I got a 90-cent raise the other day. That's the first one we'd have in 5 years, but yet inflation went up as high as 8%. And some, before I went to prison, the cost of groceries and everything was crazy. I can't even live the same as what I lived before I went to prison because inflation is so high, and I'm still making the same amount of money. And the Federal Reserve, the funny thing that people don't realize, it's not federal, it's private. And the way that it was voted in is even controversial. On December 23rd, 1913, the Senate adopted the conference report by a vote of 43 to 25, with every Democrat present voting for the measure and all but 4 Republicans voting against it. And here's the kicker: 27 senators were paired or chose not to vote. And if you'll notice, They voted on December 23rd. Guess what happens? They close the Senate early so that everybody can go home for the holidays. So they threw this vote in right at the last second. And all the people didn't even vote. 27 people did not even vote. It's kind of suspicious, you know. I mean, kind of shady, because there's a lot of people that didn't want this deal, you know. There's even conspiracy theory going around that I'm going to address here in a second. But you know, why wouldn't Satan use something like an institution if he knows that the Bible better than we do, and he knows that there's going to be great persecution and inflation? Well, the best way to get it there is to start early and start a system. So here's a article on the Federal Reserve. It's by Otis Putnam. I found it on a post on Facebook, and it says, the Federal Reserve was created in a room in the Jekyll Island Club on Jekyll Island, Georgia, in November 1910. There were 6 prominent men from banking, the financial world, U.S. Senator, etc. at this meeting to create the Federal Reserve of the United States. That's kind of an awkward sentence, but the 6 men who created the Federal Reserve were as followed. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, Senator Majority Leader A. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasurer. Henry Davison worked for J.P. Morgan. Frank Vanderlip, President of the National City Bank. And Paul Wahlberg of Investment House, Kahn and Loeb Company. Benjamin Strong, who was absent but had a heavy influence over the meeting, President, Bankers Trust Company. These men created the Aldrich Plan, which would later become the Federal Reserve. This meeting was to create the Federal Reserve, or a central bank. This meeting was to create the Federal Reserve, or a central bank, was very secretive, and it was disguised as a duck hunting trip to Jekyll Island. The 6 men boarded a private train and used their first names only. This was the creation of the First Name Club. Never heard of that. So the staff at the Jekyll Island Club wouldn't know who they were and let the cat out of the bag about their meeting. These men worked very hard, nonstop, for 10 days to create this central banking system. The meeting was so secretive that the public didn't know about it until the 1930s. Huh. Why, if this meeting was so beneficial to the public and to help, why did it have to be so secretive? Why did these six people have to just give up their first name and then go in secret? And why did they have to keep it so quiet that it didn't get out for over 20 years? Sounds like a conspiracy to me. I mean, it doesn't take that big of a stretch to really, you know. So when you add this up, and then you add the fact that they slid it by in a secret vote, and then you put it together with the crazy Titanic story, it gets kind of dicey, you know. You know, there's even more stuff that Jekyll Island has these crazy Nephilim burial grounds and stuff too. If you really want to go out in the rabbit hole on that, but I'm not. That's beyond the scope of this study. So anyway, I just thought I'd share this little bit with y'all before I sign off. You know, I was talking about the Federal Reserve and conspiracy. Well, here it is right here. I believe it's off of Wikipedia. It says, another claim that started gaining traction in late 2017 alleges that J.P. Morgan deliberately sank the ship, that's the Titanic, in order to kill off several millionaires who were in opposition to the Federal Reserve. The claim appears as early as 2002 in the book The Secret Terrorist by conspiracy theorist Bill Hughes, where it is purported that the sinking of the Titanic was part of a larger Jesuit plot to create a central bank in the United States. And I'm not so sure. I believe it's a Jesuit plot, but some of the wealthiest men in the world were aboard the Titanic for her maiden voyage, several of whom, including John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, were allegedly opposed to the creation of a U.S. central bank. No evidence of their opposition to Morgan's centralized banking ideas has been found. Astor and Guggenheim never spoke publicly on the subject, while Strauss spoke in favor of the concept. All three men died during the sinking. Conspiracy theorists suggest that Morgan arranged to have the men board the ship and then sunk it to eliminate them. Morgan canceled his ticket for the Titanic's maiden voyage due to a reported illness, while Guggenheim had not purchased a ticket before Morgan's cancellation. Morgan, nicknamed the Napoleon of Wall Street, had helped create General Electric, U.S. Steel, and International Harvester, and is the namesake of J.P. Morgan Chase, and was credited with almost single-handedly saving the U.S. banking system during the Panic of 1907. Morgan did have a hand in the creation of the Federal Reserve and owned the International Mercantile Marine, which owned the White Star Line and thus the Titanic. So what they're saying, without saying it, is, yeah, JP did have a ticket on the Titanic, and he canceled at the last minute. And yes, these rich guys were on there, and they all died. And yes, Morgan did own the Titanic. But all that's coincidence, and yes, he was in favor of the Federal Reserve, but so I'm just going to leave that with you. I mean, it's just a conspiracy theory, but it's kind of strange that all these rich people would die and J.P. Morgan would just happen to cancel at the last second, and then they just happen to shuffle this vote right through at the end of after Congress is shut down, and then it just happens to crush the middle class year after year after year after year, and push us closer and closer and closer to the tribulation every single year. Now, I'm not going to die on this hill. I just think it's fascinating. I think it's very interesting. So let me know what you think. I hope you guys find this study to be edifying and entertaining. God bless you all.